I would like to start with one fundamental question. Why do you think it's important to involve patient advocates in the development of new drugs? And I would like to ask the different parties. I would like to ask Claire, the doctor, the researcher, and the pharma people. Claire, what do you think? Why is it important?
Thanks for asking me the question first. So, I think it's important because it helps us to focus our goals on something that is relevant for patients. In my time as a consultant and being involved in setting up MPN Voice in the UK, I've learned a lot more about what disease means to a patient. And since members of my family have become patients, I've learned a lot more from a different perspective. So I think it's really important to bring the perspective in terms of defining research targets so that we try to deliver this as a community. But I also think, I referenced this in my talk this morning when I was talking about the Rethink study, the early MF study, that, you know, much as many of us would like to think we know all the answers, we really don't. And, you know, for me, I thought my patients wouldn't be interested in that study, but actually they were interested in that study. So to really help us, inform us to set the target, think about what's really appropriate, but then also to, when we're thinking about a research study, to think about balancing the risks. And there was a very nice discussion about how do we write a patient information sheet. I hand patients very thick documents and they're unwell and they're trying to make decisions about clinical trials. And you know, it's the first time they've even had this discussed. So I think it's really, really important all round.
Yeah.
Is this on?
Okay, you tell us your opinion about it.
Sure. So again, Dave Dubinski from Insight. I would say the importance is really around having a full understanding of what could be a tangible outcome for patients. And in order to do that, we have to understand what patients consider of value. I think having that understanding can help us better determine not only endpoints that we may include in our trials early on before we get into our phase 3, as well as better understanding the risk-benefit ratio of some of the trials and compounds that are being developed.
You?
Sure, Amber from Novartis. Again, I think we all are on the same page or agree with the approach. I think in the end, as industry, we're creating drugs to get to patients. So how do we do that in the best way possible? How do we do it so that it's going to actually benefit a patient or it's going to be meaningful to the patient? So I think we covered the different pieces through the different perspectives shared. But I do think some of the points raised throughout this session is around that multi-stakeholder piece. Everyone's looking for different element. What is regulatory agencies looking for? What are the reimbursement bodies looking for? How do we all work together to kind of define, you know, a trial or get to develop treatments that are actually going to be meaningful to the patient, but then also are accepted in the, you know, healthcare environment?
Okay, who else? One of the researchers, would you like to answer?
I'm flattered as I'm getting the researcher, but I mean, I think this is crucial because the patients look at the disease and what they want from it. And I think if you go back to imatinib, you know, it was the patient group pushed that. The researchers, which I'm flattered to be put in that bracket, are looking at getting the next experiment done and finding out what is going on. The doctors are anxious in getting treatment to their patients, but they're designing it. The pharmaceutical companies want to get the drugs out there to the patients, but they have other motives as well. And if you look back to imatinib, it was the patient group who suddenly picked this up and said, we need this. How do we get this out? there. So I think it's crucial, patient involvement.
So I would like to ask Amber, when is the stage, when would you like us to be involved in these questions?
Thank you. I think, we as a company, Novartis, we're really working on all those stages. When you look at that slide that was just presented from you, Patty, or the paper that Sarunas presented, we're trying to get to there. And I think some of you who've worked with us before will say, well, you're not there, or you're doing some of it, ad hocly. And I think that's just the challenge of our complex organization. But we are trying from earlier on to disease understanding. What is the patient experience? What is their journey? What are you experiencing, to then figure out, well, what is needed, to then start with what is our first design or protocol. At our company, we have a clinical development program. It really lays out what the plan is for the trial or the program with a compound. And what we're doing right now is, at all different levels, creating a systematic approach to that involvement. So even with that CDP, that first document that we create, we're trying to say, what are the touch points for the patient engagement? And in an ideal situation, we want to do this parallel to where we get physician input. So we're seeing it as, and in my role and others within the company, as how do we say, when we stop and have an advisory board with physicians, are we talking to patients too? Are we doing it together? Each time that we talk to a physician about input for our development program, are we doing that paralleled with the patient perspective? Because then we can actually see a comprehensive view of our trial and our approach. So at all different stages, we're trying it.
And I'll just add to that, from our perspective, I think throughout the development, as Amber has said, is important, because certainly understanding from a patient's perspective what the unmet needs are, and again, going back to the value and understanding how we can help with that. But I would say at a minimum that the patient voice needs to be incorporated in our pivotal or phase 3 trials, which are the trials that are submitted to the regulatory agencies for approval, and also provide the science and clinical data that physicians will use to appropriately prescribe the drugs. So without having a good understanding of the patient perspective of what's needed, where the gaps are, I think we could miss out on that opportunity. And it takes a lot of time and a lot of dollars to do the phase 3 trials. So it's important to get that right in the beginning.
See, I just wanted to make another comment. I think there's another party that we should be thinking about their involvement, and that's the payers, because it's all well and good to have a wonderfully designed trial that answers clinical endpoints, but unless we provide the data that ends up with the drug being reimbursed, we are going to really struggle. And this is a little bit where we are with ruxolitinib and PV, that we don't have the kind of data that bodies like NICE and other health reimbursement bodies need. So I think it's really important as advocates that this audience understands what is required for a drug to be reimbursed in their communities. And a second point, if I may, is that okay?
You may.
That clinical trials that deliver relevance, or scientific research that delivers relevance, is not just about always a conversation with the pharma companies. So, for example, the landmark study that I know there's a lot of discussion about, there was yesterday, that was supported by Novartis, but actually it's told us a lot about patient need, gaps between patients and physicians. In the UK, we have a national MPN group for running trials, and we have patient representation there to ask what studies should we be doing, as well as what should our endpoints in particular studies be.
Thanks. This sounds to me like an idealistic world. I'll be with you, John, in a minute. Everybody is saying that the value that patient representative can bring into the clinical trial is really a win-win situation. We hear the doctors, we hear the pharma. Certainly, we, the advocates, have been pushing this for Amber 5 years, at least we start a discussion. But still, the process is not moving forward, not at least in the pace that we would like to see it. I mean, we started, and you know that I like to be provocative, we started discussing among us that maybe patient advocacy groups should encourage patients to join clinical trials only where patient representatives are sitting and participating. And clinical trials that are developed without patient representative, maybe we should not encourage a patient to join. So that's a provocative. We are not there yet. But we want to understand what are the challenges, both from the pharma perspective, internal and external, and also from the doctor's perspective. Because I can tell you, I was invited to participate in an advisory board of clinical trial 5 years ago. I was in the first meeting together with all the investigators, and then the connection was cut. And then we had an advisory board of that company 5 years later, asking what happened? Why didn't I continue to be on the same steering committee that I was invited? And they said the doctor refused to have a patient in the room together with them. So there is a resistance from some of the doctors, and of course, we see that there are challenges in the companies. So please explain to us so we can better understand what are the challenges.
No, I think you gave one of my examples, Giora. I think there's multiple layers of challenge. One is, and I know it's not, the simple answer is we have a complex organization. At Novartis, we have a very complex layered system of who does what and who's in charge. So to be honest, as we're looking to our systematic approach, making this more consistent, getting patients involved in all our trials, or at least considered for the involvement in the trials, it's actually a cultural shift in our company. It's not just we've created this protocol, this approach, this is the plan, everyone do it. It just is impossible for the size and the layer of our company. So as we talk about how to do this and share best practice internally, where we've brought that patient perspective in, what the outcomes are, it's back to Alfonso's discussion earlier of the evidence. Ourselves, we're trying to generate evidence internally to show the value of what we've done, to therefore say why culturally in the company to get our clinicians, our researchers to understand the value. It isn't always as easy as just everyone do it. We can't flip a switch one day and everyone just starts doing it. The other element, and Giora, I'm glad you mentioned it, is it creates this, there's that multi-stakeholder piece to it, and I think that is the challenge we have. We are trying to put more patient advocates on steering committees. We've done it in 2 disease areas, and we struggle with one, the physicians resist sometimes, and we can't control that. I think there is the advocacy component from all of you to say to physicians we need to be involved, and we have different physicians who feel differently about that role of patient involvement. The other piece of it is just I just lost my train of thought. The idea of shifting the patient physician perspective. I think the other thing we struggle with, and I just had this conversation the other day, was what makes the most sense for patient involvement, meaning we need more perspective from the patient community of where's your time best spent and the value. I think it's easy to say we want to be involved in everything, but in reality, there are some activities that you're going to want to be involved in and some you're not, or where is the right place? So we've talked about, is it every single advisory board with physicians we have to have a patient involvement? Is it at the program level? So we are doing, for example, in CML, ABL is our next compound. And so is it that for every trial that we ever do for ABL, we have patient involvement? Is it more hematologic based? We have a special committee of patient advocates who share their input onto all our hematology trials. So I think even as a company, we're trying to figure out what makes the most sense, but we need that feedback and discussion to know where your time is going to be well spent. I know everyone wants to be involved, but we wonder, are you going to get the value you want? Is your expectation going to be managed if we put you on every single activity? And I think that's for even hearing from the patient perspective to give us.
Sure.
I was going to say, what I often ask my colleagues is, first, did we engage patients in the activity? And then if the answer is yes is yes, what changed because of that engagement? And I think it goes to what Amber's saying. It's being able to measure the value of that input, and then representing that throughout the company. I think one of the things that we can do a better job at as patient advocates in our companies are defining what are those points and what are ways to measure it. So, for example, having patient input into a clinical protocol early could change how many addendums come, how often the protocol is changed, or how fast the trial enrolls. And I think it's measuring that and making sure that the rest of our company has a good understanding of that, because just as in everyday business and all the activities we do, we'd like to get everybody's input, but at some point, if you keep collecting input, you don't move things forward either. So it's a balance of moving forward as well as understanding where the input has value.
I think there's a large number of other groups that I think patients could make a huge difference with. And that's all the regulatory authorities, the FDA, NICE, ethics, because we've heard a bit already about patient information sheets that go on for pages and pages. I feel very strongly about this. I hate when I have to present this. Here's the patient information sheet, and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Because all these authorities say you have to put that in, and you have to put that in, and you have to put that in. And I think there's a huge role that patient advocates could make with all these authorities. Now, sometimes they are represented. Our ethics committee has somebody, but it's somebody way from where, God knows where. So that you could make a huge difference to some of these authorities if you could get in there and say, look, here's how it works from the patient point of view. If you do this and you make them do a patient information sheet that goes on forever, what's the implication for that if I've got a disease and have to go through this?
Thanks. John, you want to?
Thank you. So earlier this morning we heard some amazing and really exciting material about emerging therapies, discoveries in the field, etc. Now, speaking for a patient community that does not yet have a cure for our diseases, isn't it true that the biggest frustration that we as patients have is the speed at which these therapies are emerging and the huge cost of them once they have emerged? I think that is by far the biggest problem that we have in this field. And now it's my turn to be provocative. Isn't it true that mandating patient involvement in the trials process has the danger of slowing things down and making things cost more?
No. Sorry, I do
Good
think
answer.
so. Yeah. But I think I would like to challenge this community to provide a faculty of clinicians and a trained faculty of patients, rather, who could be available to review protocols, to give insights. And I think that's hugely challenging, and it would be very demanding time-wise. So I think a faculty is really, really important. And I would just like to shine a spotlight on the fact that I'm sorry that it feels to you that it's taking a long time, but we've talked a lot about imatinib and CML. It took nearly 40 years after the discovery of the Philadelphia chromosome, which is the marker abnormality in CML, to get imatinib into clinical trials for patients. It took 2 years after the description of the JAK2 V617F mutation to get ruxolitinib into phase 1-2 trials. We're quick. But we mustn't be too quick, because we run the risk of exposing patients to, risks if we go too early, too fast with drugs. And I think, Dave, you want to come in there?
Yeah, that was the example I was going to give for ruxolitinib. From when we started development to approval was 4.5 years, which is pretty unusual. And to your question, will mandating patient input into trials slow things down? I think this is a case where it sped it up. The endpoints for ruxolitinib, the first and main endpoint was around spleen reduction, but the second was around symptom management. I think a phase 3 trial without the input from patients and the regulatory agencies' willingness to work with industries to get things faster, the secondary endpoint could have been survival or something that would have taken much longer to run in trials. But what was helpful was understanding the symptom burden and how large that is on MPN patients. And with that knowledge and with the tools and input from the patients themselves, we were able to incorporate the SAF tool, which allowed for a quicker approval.
Thanks, Dave. Sarunas, you are sitting on advisory board with scientists and investigators. Do you feel that your participants is slowing down the process?
To the contrary, I would say actually another fact, a big fat figure, 9 out of 10 clinical trials fail. 10% succeed. That's a huge waste. That's tens of billions of euros, dollars that are wasted a year. So when you're thinking of including patient, is not making the stupid mistakes. So if you would have not a regulated process, if you would have, just let's speak about the bees and honey, that's a different discussion as opposed to do you like this endpoint, do you like this data set which is being generated, do you like something on top of that, do you think the design would let it recruit? And we've already seen, for example, in CML community that we had very good compounds, but because of something wrong in the protocol, they would either not launch, the regulators would actually be the ones slowing them down because it's not pretty clear, or they wouldn't recruit and that they would really be redone. So, and when we are thinking of let's make it work, it doesn't mean that we are now reinventing the wheel. It's actually, the process is out there. We just want an equal ground that, let's say, the physicians are already having. And it doesn't mean that, we are not into par, that we are not able to contribute. It doesn't mean that you need to be speaking with every same expertise depth as a physician because you're bringing other perspective. And it's very good, actually, in this, like you're saying, patient, we have this community advisory board. So our own membership, it is very good to have diversified backgrounds of the people. Some who are very good at technical knowledge, someone who are maybe very just emotional in how we feel. And you need all of these varied skills in there to represent the community because there is no perfect patient and there is no one perfect patient advocate. Each of us is biased, as I've explained, we have different perspectives, and this is why you would really have to have differentiated background of these people to actually not prolong, but to reduce and improve efficiency.
And I think this is Claire's concept of a broad faculty of enabled patients, right?
Yeah, I think so. But I would also like to make the point that, Insight was a relatively small biopharma company. So, for them to be able to reach into the patient community, it's got to be visible. They can pretty much connect with the patient community and physician community, and the physician community is very well connected, I think, to the patient community, and increasingly so. But to be evident, a lot of the compounds that Mary Frances was presenting, so PRM151, imetelstat, initially they were with small biopharma. So big pharma can see patient advocacy groups. They've got whole departments that support, but small ones don't. So it needs to be out there and visible.
Alfonso, you want?
Yeah, I just wanted to add something, and it's good that you sent this provocative question because I felt provoked. And
that was the idea.
That's the idea. I would say that from my experience and from what I'm witnessing now, I would say that the proper involvement of patient advocates in the whole research question is not only not slowing but accelerating some kind of stuff. And I would put to you some examples. One of the things I would say that in front of the regulator, in front of the European Medicines Agency, one of the most active stakeholders trying to promote and move away from the gold standard in research to really have faster approval has been patient advocates. The thing is that we have had this mantra of that research, from preclinical stages to have a phase 3 and an approval takes from 12 to 14 years and costs thousands of billions of euros, and some patient advocacies just started to question this fact. So in the sense that, is there no other way to produce a certain level of evidence, especially for those patients who has really unmet needs? And this has been taken, and I mean, some advocates, I would recall veterinary in melanoma, which is, a heart disease in which there are a lot of unmet needs as an urgency, have been working together to see how to include these adaptive pathways or adaptive trials to really speed things up. Another way in which I think patient advocates has done a lot, I have another good example, and you might be familiar with that, which is Myeloma UK, when they developed the clinical trial network. And they have achieved to, first of all, put together a network of scientists and researchers, and they have achieved to have faster trials, faster recruitment, cheaper trials, and also they have been able to have some research priority that probably won't never be addressed by a pharmaceutical company. So in that sense, I think not only collaborating, but also acting on our side, we can really speed things up, and having us involved is not... I think we are right now moving from this model of just stating out the problems to start thinking about solutions. And we're able to deliver, because even though the data needs to be there, our opinion also can add value to the whole thing. And there are some examples that proves that.
Thanks. My next question is coming from experience I had last week. In Israel, there was a meeting of ISPO, Israeli branch, and there was a discussion, should the patient perspective and patient be involved in the HTA process, in the drug reimbursement process. It was specifically for Israel. Now, we as patient organization, we've been, of course, involved, unfortunately, until now, only in the HTA process, because when the drug comes up for reimbursement, we are pushing the reimbursement with everything we can. If we need to demonstrate, we'll demonstrate. If we need to send letters, we'll send letters. And because we want the drug, we know that the patients need the drug, and it's sometimes life-saving, sometimes it's improving quality of life. We want to make the drug accessible to our patients. But then we start getting criticism, and the criticism is that we are actually representing the pharma and not ourselves, because the pharma is making the profit as expected from the drugs, and we as a patient are pushing for the drug reimbursement, and we are getting a lot of criticism. So the question is, I want to ask different stakeholders, do you think that patients, representative or advocates should be involved in the HTA or reimbursement process? Amber?
I think so. I think it's important. I think the criticism is there. I can hear the criticism. I think it shouldn't be driven by pharma. I don't think we are the ones telling, should be driving you to do it. But to your point, patients need options. They need treatment. So, and I think, and actually Claire and I were having this conversation earlier during the break about, patients need to also help to demonstrate value. We could do our trials better to show the value, but also I think there is that patient perspective, that patient voice in the HTA process that's needed to show those agencies and independently, the patient voice independently, that this is the value it's bringing. I've seen different examples where patients are sharing the quality of life impact that different treatments have for them, which is why they need these drugs. And I think, Gira, it's the point about how we keep a firewall, keep a different distance, because you need to be credible in that discussion. The other thing we're doing a little bit more as a company too is in our real-world evidence studies, or in some cases post-marketing, or just more broadly understanding more of the quality of life pieces of the disease, or where the drugs, what things we need to look at from our different treatments, is bringing multi-stakeholders together. So we have examples where we've had a real-world evidence ad board with the goal that we'd decide what the questions are that we as a company want to generate to then bring to different regulatory or HTA authorities. And in those kind of circumstances, we've had payer representation, physician representation, and advocate representation. So it's a way to all agree on those different questions, what we as a company want to investigate, while there's a whole nother track, I think, for patients to share their viewpoint.
I just wanted to share our experience of taking ruxolitinib to NICE in the UK. We had to go twice to get before we finally had approval, and we still only have restricted approval. But the most powerful voice